Brian is right when he says I do spend some time thinking about these topics. And if you've been around Abide, you know that I've gone heavy a few times on you with some marriage topics. I've gone deep a few times with you on some topics that are related to teenagers. And tonight, we're going to go foundational as we launch this year of Abide. And I'll start off by saying I don't know if you are like me or if this is happening in your home, but I have a wife who forces me on a yearly basis to do things that I don't want to do necessarily, but are necessary to do. One of those things is going to the doctor. She makes me go to the doctor. She makes me get a checkup. She makes me have an evaluation where I check the relationship that I have with my physical body to make sure everything's fine so that I am around. And much as I don't want to do these things, it's a necessary reality, an important thing for me to do, to go to the doctor. And this week in particular is really annoying because not only do I have to get my blood drawn tomorrow before I have some meetings, but then like right after that on Monday, I have to go to the dentist. So we stack all these evaluations up and it becomes difficult. Well, evaluations are something that we all do in order to maintain health when we have a relationship with something. So if you have a relationship with your body that you want to maintain and not have it collapse, you need to go to the dentist, you need to go to the doctor, you need to get things checked out. But it's also true in other areas of life. If you are an employee, or an employer, you're going to have some sort of evaluation that you either do with your boss or with your employees at some point in time to determine where you are, where your status is in the company or your position or your success. You even do this on a bigger scale in your company when you think about where does our company stand? Where does our business stand? How are we doing? Let's evaluate and make the proper adjustments. And so, of course, we won't talk about this one too soon, right? Okay. There's going to be a financial evaluation that we might even do in our own lives because we want to make sure that our relationship that we have with our finances is appropriate, going in the right direction. And many people, when it comes to this one, are checking this thing daily, which if you're doing right now is a roller coaster, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. But we tend to think about these things more often than we do about the relationship that we have with our spouse. Sometimes it is necessary for us to take a step back and to evaluate and say, where are we as a couple? Where are we in our marriage? And so what I want to do tonight is I want to set aside our time tonight to evaluate where you guys are, where we are as couples, where you and your spouse are in your relationship. And the goal of this, just from the onset, is not to cause fights or dissension or discourage you or dishearten you. It's the opposite. It's to get us to a place where we're being honest and open about where we are. To say, are there things in our marriage that need to change? Are there things that are going well that we need to praise one another for and praise together as a group, celebrate with one another? Or do we need to make some changes? Okay, so this is a night where I'm hoping that each person, as we're starting off a whole season of Abide, where we'll dive into some deep and hard topics about marriage and parenting and other things, that we can kind of have a foundational conversation together about where each of us are in our relationship with our spouses. So to do that, I want to go through 4 kind of things to evaluate for you. And again, these are foundational and simple things, but I want to give you some categories for your evaluation. And the point of this is for you to go to your group after this, to take these biblical foundational concepts and to discuss them together. Now, for some of you, that might be somewhat difficult. It might feel awkward. You might feel like you don't want to open up about it. I want to just strongly encourage you that this is what the whole point of this ministry is. So if you cannot talk about your marriage in this context, then you're not going to get as much out of it, so I want to encourage you to do that. On the back of your questionnaire, you have those questions, but you also have questions that I wrote just for you and your spouse to do. So when it comes to this, if you do have some things you don't necessarily want to talk about, I have some additional extra credit homework for you to do with your spouse just between the two of you. Some of these things are more personal between the two of you. Some of them might cause a little bit of a disagreement between the two of you. I've even given you recommendations to not talk about some things until later because I know that they can cause issues, okay? And I made a misspelling. I don't want you to elevate your conflicts. I want to alleviate your conflicts. I didn't have time to change it. Okay. All right. So please don't come and say, Pastor Doug wanted us to elevate our conflicts in our marriage. That's not what the goal is. All right, alleviate. It's hard to spell. Okay, words are hard. All right, here's some categories that I want us to think through. As we think about a marriage assessment, what is the things that we need to assess to say, where are we? Where are we at? What do we need to change? What do we need to think about? And now I'm sure we can come up with a really exhaustive list of a million different things to look at and think through. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to pull the lens back as high as we can and say, what does the Bible clarify and distill for us are the key essential things that we should be thinking about? And so the first thing that came to my mind that I'm hoping that we all care about is the role that we have. So I want each and every one of you to have some time tonight as you go through your questions to evaluate your commitment to your biblical roles. All right? Evaluate your commitment to the biblical roles. And I'll say it this way. God has designed the roles of a husband and wife on purpose, with intention, with a plan for the best for your marriage. That these roles are not made so that you would just have to suffer through. This is made with a design and an intention. And so if God has designed something to work in a specific way, we want to be obedient and find ourselves in those roles, committed to those roles, and functioning within those roles as He has intended. So I want to make sure that everybody has this on their radar, and then for you to evaluate, am I doing that? Now, a lot of you have gone through this before, and this is foundational stuff, as I said, but it's always good to think this way. So let's do a little bit of a biblical exam of the roles. So let's start with the husband's role here. Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to be in here a lot, as you know, but let's just cover this briefly. It says this, husbands, what are you to do? Love your wives. How are you to do that? That's the command. The first thing husbands are to do is this word love. How are you to do it? We're to do it as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. And then there's this additional information of how Christ did that, what the purpose was, that He might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that He might present the church to Himself in splendor without any spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And then we have this really important phrase that is said next, which is, in the same way that Christ loves the church and cares about her sanctification and her holiness and presenting her blameless back to God, that we should have that same care for our wives in the way that we love our wives. So in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. In the same way that you take care of yourself every day and brush your teeth and go to the doctor and go to the dentist, right? You should have a care the same way you would think about your day, yourself, your activities, your work for your spouse. That's the quality of the love that you have. It says, he who loves his wife loves himself. For no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it. So there's a few things here in this context and just this one passage about what the husband's role are. We know that husbands are to love their wives, the kind of love that is described here, and even some details about the nourishing, cherishing nature of that love towards the wife. That's the husband's role. Now there's more, of course, that the Bible has to say about this, and this is not exhaustive, but we'll cover some things here. Colossians 3:19, here it is again. Husbands, love your wives. Now a different qualifier that is thrown on here, just so we're clear, and do not be harsh with them. This is not a love that is difficult. It's not a love that's overbearing. It's not a love that is self-pleasing, of course, as we learned in Ephesians, but now we have some additional qualifications for how this role is to function. You are to love your wives in such a way that thinks about them in a certain way that where you're not going to be harsh with them, overbearing with them, you're not going to exacerbate them, you're wanting to accomplish something good for them. And another text, 1 Peter 3:7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, a very similar context of not being harsh. You're considering their needs, what they have going on, what their day was like. You're living with them in an understanding way, and you're showing honor. You're not, again, provoking the wife. You're not putting her down. You're not doing any of these things. And you're seeing her as a weaker vessel, knowing that you have the ability to, maybe because of the strength that God has given you as just a man, that you could do harm to your wife, given your authority and given your strength. And so he says, don't live with your wife in that way. No, love your wife in this way. Live with them in this way. And it says, since they're heirs, co-equal heirs to the grace of life. There's no distinction in how God sees the two of you, but there is a distinction in roles and how those roles work out. One additional text here, 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the wife is the husband, and the head of Christ is God. And so this is an example, I could have gone to it in Ephesians, but the idea that the husband has authority as God designed it in the relationship as head over the wife. And what that means is God has placed an authoritative role, a leadership role in the home, that the husband is the leader in the home. That's what that is. So if I were to distill this down, I'll just put some points out here. What is the husband's role? Well, you're to love like Christ. What does that mean? You're to love selflessly. You're to love your wife as it's your own body is the way that it's used. You're to nourish and cherish your wife. You're to love your wife as yourself. This is the qualifications of what you're supposed to be doing in your role. You're to live with your wife in an understanding way. You're to show honor to your wife, right? It's a lot of things, but it's really kind of summing up really just a few things in different ways, right? And the last one is that you're to function as her leader. You're to be her head. God has given you the authority in the relationship as her head, and so you're to function within that role since he has declared that to be true. So all these things kind of sum up, and I've summed them up for you, and they all kind of point to the same three things, which is what are you supposed to do? Love your wife. Lots of qualifications, lots of explanation of what that looks like. We're not going to get into all that. Lead your wife and care for your wife. Now, you could probably throw the care back in with the love, but I wanted to isolate that out just because it probably needs to be said sometimes. So just to distill it down simply, what's the husband's role? Here it is. You need to love your wife, all that the Bible says that is. You need to lead your wife, be the leader spiritually, physically, emotionally. You got to care for your family. You got to lead financially. You got to do all these things in terms of your leadership role in the home, and you need to care for your wife, care for her, selflessly loving her. All right. That's the role of the husband that every single husband in this room should fit into. And when I say evaluate your role, your biblical role, your commitment to a biblical role, we need to look at this list, and at first we need to say, of course we're not doing this fully. Of course we're not, because we can't fully love our wives like Christ loved the church. We can't lead as well as Christ leads the church. We can't care for our wives in the same way that Christ is the church, to the totality. So there needs to be a sense where all of us in this room as men are, when we're evaluating our relationship and commitment to the role, can say, I'm not doing as good as I could be doing. And that's not to discourage us, that's to motivate us to greater action and greater commitment to know what Christ has done for us, how he leads us as the church, and our responsibility to lead our wives. That's our first step of evaluation. But of course, what about the wife's role? The wife's role is distilled maybe even more simply in a few phrases. Ephesians chapter 5 as well. What are wives supposed to do? Submit to your own husbands, not to all husbands, not to the husband across the table, to your husband, right? And you're to do that as to the Lord. You're to submit to your husband as you would the Lord, because there is a headship factor that's going on, all right? There's some qualifications to this, of course. You're not to follow or submit to your husband when they lead you into sin or do something unbiblical. There's all those qualifications. But the general statement, of course, is wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Right? And it says in verse 24, now as the church submits to Christ in the same way that the church does that, which is total submission to Christ as the church, so also wives should submit in everything. Here's a qualifier of what they mean, what Paul means by this in Ephesians, to their husbands. Okay? So we have some qualifying statements, just like we did in Ephesians chapter 5 with the husbands, of what love looks like. Now we have an understanding of the qualifications of what submission looks like. It's as to the Lord, in the same way that the church submits to Christ, in everything. We've got qualifications so that we're clear on this. In addition, I won't read this whole passage, same passage I just had on the screen for husbands, but at the bottom of this, I kind of highlighted it for you, and I'm sure it's a little hard to see because it's small text. It says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself. We already covered that, but now here's an additional phrase that's given to the wives, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. That is one of the things that over and over again, the Bible calls wives to do in the function of their role. They are to respect their husbands, not only to submit, but to respect. 1 Peter 3, again, clarifies these two things for us. Likewise, wives, be subject, same type of phrase, same idea, submission to your own husbands. Again, not someone else, to your own husbands. So that even if they do not obey the word, this is talking about Christian wives, right? Even if your husband does not do what God is telling him to do, that you may have some sort of impact on your husband and win them by the conduct of their wives, right? Whether believer or unbeliever. And it says in verse 2, when they see you're respectful, respect, there it is again, a qualification of what the wife is supposed to do in her role, and pure conduct, that's going to do something, right? Then it gives some additional information about what the priorities should be. And then in verse 5, it says, now this is how the holy woman who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by doing what? Not by adorning themselves with braids and jewelry and clothes and going to the gym and getting weird injections and stuff, right? But by submitting themselves to their own husbands, just as Sarah did, all right? And then here's the verse that I like to use out of context with my wife to some degree and tell her she should call me Lord. Okay, move on. She doesn't like it when I say that. All right. Additionally, just to go back to the foundation of the role that God created when he established both man and woman, created them and put them together into a relationship, he clarifies in Genesis that the role of the wife is to be man's helper, to make him a helper fit for him, to be a support, to be a helper, to come alongside. There's lots of things that you can say about that. That's a part or function of the wife's role. So here's a list. They're all very similar, so here you go. Submit to your husbands, be subject to your husbands, respect your husbands, submit in everything, some qualification there, and be his helper. That's just some phrases taken from these passages, and if you summarize all of that and kind of distill that down into 3 things, it's pretty easy. You can say, what are you supposed to do, wives? What's your role? It's to submit to your husbands, respect your husbands, and be the helper to your husbands. Help your husbands, to be his support, to come alongside of him. That's how this works. Your husband is to take the lead. You are to respond to his leadership. Your husband is to love you, and you are supposed to respond to his love. When he leads, you're to respect him in his leadership. You're to respect him in his love. The husbands are supposed to do this selflessly, not caring about themselves, and there needs to be some sort of support that the wife then gives back to the husband, and he gives of himself. She comes alongside of him to bolster him up as he expends himself for her sake. Okay? These 2 things go together. They're cyclical. They support one another. They help one another. And when they are not functioning, when you step outside of these roles, then begins you stepping outside of God's design for your marriage, and issues begin. When I sit in the counseling office with couples, one of my first thoughts is always to say, where did we go wrong on God's design for our roles and these people not sitting and functioning in them? And this happens to me. I sit there, I have an argument with my wife. Something's going on. There's a problem. And I think, did I love my wife here? Did I care for her? Did I speak harshly to her? I begin evaluating what God's word says about how I am to function in my role, and she begins evaluating in her head how she is to function. Was she disrespectful to me? Did she submit, or did she insist on her own way? Was she being quarrelsome, or is she responding in respect and support to me? We both begin to do this evaluation in our own minds and reset where we are in our function within our roles. So if you're trying to figure out where are we in our marriage, maybe things are going well or they're not well, this is the first area for you to consider, because it's clear biblically where God wants you to function. If you are not walking in these things regularly, this is a cause for difficulty, for struggle, for affliction in your married life. So I have some questions around this. You'll go through those in your group. This is the first area. You need to evaluate your commitment to these biblical roles. Be committed to those things. Just as a brief example, I think it's funny. I think I've said this before from the stage, but I'm handy. I have tools. I like to fix things around the house. My wife is not only not handy, doesn't like to fix things, but when she tries to fix things, she always uses the wrong thing to fix it with. And it's always bothersome to me because she gets frustrated when she takes a tool that is not meant for the job and it doesn't work. And it bothers me because I look at her and I say, you know that a high heel is not a hammer, okay? Right? You know that a drill is not a pry bar, and yet you try to use it in that way. If you were to just use the tool as designed for its function, there would be a lot less frustration, there'd be a lot less difficulty, there'd be a lot more joy in working on the projects that you hate to do. In our marriages, we need to think this way. God has designed your function within the marriage, in your role. And when you step out of that function, it starts to be like a high heel that's supposed to be worn on your foot to make you look good, being used as something to drive a nail in. It doesn't work so well. If you can get that right thing in the right function, then there's going to be a benefit. There's going to be a benefit in your marriage. So evaluate your commitment and try to make sure you're living within those functions for how God has designed you to function. All right, second thing is this. Evaluate your level of intimacy. Not only should we be thinking about our roles and how we function within those roles, but we want to think about our intimacy. And I'll use some synonyms for you here so you know what I mean. I'm not just talking about sex here, though I am talking about that. I'm talking about closeness. I'm talking about companionship. I'm talking about togetherness. I'm talking about enjoyment of one another. Okay? These are all things that the Bible kind of makes us think of when we read the stories about marriage that are given to us in the Word, and as we have specific descriptions. Here's a few for you, just so that we can cover just a few in terms of intimacy. Genesis, the foundation of this is built into Genesis here in the beginning, when God says, "It is not good for man to be alone, I will make a helper fit for him." The idea of this is companionship. There is a togetherness between man and woman that is good and that is necessary and that is helpful. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody has to be married, but there is a complementary nature of how men and women work together that is put together in a way where we can say, we've got a companion now. We've got a companion with a purpose to glorify God, to live for Christ. We have a companion, and we need to be close together. There's some additional things that I think you can infer that this is the idea of what's being said in some sense. Even in Proverbs 31, we're talking about an excellent wife who can find. She is more precious than jewels. There is a value. There's a value. There's an enjoyment. There's a joy that you get when you have a spouse that is excellent, right? When you are enmeshed together in a way where there's mutual enjoyment of one another, there's some sort of benefit, okay? She does good for her husband and not harm all the days of her life. He enjoys her. She enjoys her role with him. There's some sort of intimacy, some sort of connection there. Even this idea that an excellent wife, again, I'm sure you could say this in both ways, but this context here is a good husband, an excellent life, it's a crown. There's a joy to the other party. There's some sort of enjoyment that happens here. But one who is not a good, there's shame, there's disconnection. Right? Rottenness to the bones. There's a decaying, rotting sense when people are separated if you're not functioning within your roles and trying to be connected with one another. Now, of course, we have to go, when I say intimacy, companionship, relationship, to physical intimacy, and we got to go to 1 Corinthians 7, of course, and I know that that's also a little difficult to see, but I'll read it. Paul makes it very clear how this works. He says, "Now concerning the matters which I wrote to you, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." It's a general statement. He wants to clarify what he means. He means sexual immorality, not all sexual engagement, because then he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality. He's saying, here's a general statement. It's probably best if men and women don't have sex because it can be a problem, and I think we can all see that, right? But because we, as human beings, have a desire to procreate, there's some sort of physical sexual desire that is innate in a lot of people, that God gives us the ability to marry and to have that type of intimate sexual relationship. And because of the temptation to have that be with multiple parties, which is outside of God's will, which is sexual morality, because of that temptation, Paul then clarifies and says what's good is that each man should have his own wife and each woman should have her own husband. That there should be a mutual engagement of physical intimacy just between the two of you. And then he clarifies of what that should look like. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. It's interesting the way he even phrases it, rights. They're yours and you're giving them to your husband. And likewise, the wife to her husband. So husband to the wife, wife to the husband. Verse 4, "For the wife does not have authority over her own body." When you get married, there is an exchange of authority where you come underneath the authority of your husband as head of your home, but there's also an exchange of authority where your body is no longer your own. It is given to your spouse in terms of the sexual fulfillment of that, and vice versa. There's an exchange. Husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And then the generalized statement here, do not deprive one another in this regard. Now, I bring this up, and I bring this up as an evaluative factor. And we talked about this last year if you were here, but to evaluate your level of intimacy, I will say it this way. if you are here and you do not have a regular, consistent, satisfying, fruitful, physical, sexual relationship with your spouse, that to me is a problem because it is indicative that there is a relational lack of intimacy in your marriage, right? That's how those two things go together. Because it's going to be really hard for you to be close physically if you are separated or there's division between the two of you relationally. That's a very difficult thing to have. So a very good marker for a relationship as you're evaluating your relationship is to say, where are we at in terms of our physical intimacy? Are we having problems there? Are we not wanting that? Is there problems? Now, of course, there's lots of caveats. I can give a million caveats of why it won't work or this issue or that issue. There's lots of those things. But in the generalized circumstance, that is a good way to evaluate where you're at. There's more ways to evaluate that, but to sit down and say, do we feel like we connect? Do we have times to connect? Not just physically, just relationally. Do we go out on dates? Do we do things where we feel like we are connecting on a soul level with one another in a way to engage, to feel like we know one another, right? Which is the biblical language that is used so often of marriage, that a husband knows his wife, a wife knows her husband. There's, of course, a physical connotation, but there's a deeper connotation to that it explains the intimacy, the oneness of the relationship between husband and wife. So, evaluate your roles, evaluate your level of intimacy. I'll ask you to do that in a general relational sense in your group and then one-on-one in a physical sense with your spouse. Third area to evaluate is the way in which you manage conflict. And what I mean by this is not to say, do you ever get into conflict? Because I'm assuming that you all do. And if you don't, come talk to me afterwards and give us some pointers, okay? We all are going to engage in conflict in our relationship in one way, shape, or form. Whether that's full-blown fights, as people would call it, disagreements, quarreling, quibbling, or as my father-in-law likes to say, intense fellowship. So there's lots of levels of this, but conflict exists. Conflicts exist in any relationship. And so my question for you is not necessarily, do you have conflict in your relationship? It's how much conflict do you have in your relationship? And maybe more importantly, how do you manage that conflict? So is your goal in managing the conflict that does arise in your marriage to resolve it quickly, to forgive, and to move past it? Or is the trajectory of your relationship to have ongoing conflict, ongoing battles, worsening fights, conflicts, and intense fellowship to where now the path is set for you to be embattled against one another in quarrels and fights? And so if you want to evaluate and say, okay, of course I get into a fight with my spouse every now and then, but when that happens, what happens next? Do we resolve quickly? Do we seek to forgive? Do we seek to give grace to one another? Do we rely on the understanding of the God forgiving us when we have sinned against Him? Do we look to that to be able to look at our spouse and say, of course I can forgive you when you sin against me because I'm relying on what Christ has done for us as my motivation? Some verses, just to talk about the importance of this. You know these ones. I'm so sorry I have to bring them up, and I wish there were some for men, but there's not. I don't know. It is better to live on a corner of a housetop than share a house with a quarrelsome wife, okay? I think you can say this for a man as well, which is written particularly this way in the Bible, right? It's better to live on the corner of a housetop than to share a house with a quarrelsome wife. Another proverb, of course, it's a continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife, they're alike. It's the same thing. To restrain her is to restrain the wind or to grasp oil in one's right hand. This is not something that is good. That's just the basic biblical principle derived from these two verses. Having a quarrelsome household between husband and wife is bad. That's not the goal. The goal is to have intimacy and closeness and togetherness and companionship and not to have quarreling and fighting. And if this is the pattern of your marriage, there needs to be an adjustment. There needs to be an evaluation. Say, where are we? Do we need to improve this? Are we doing pretty good? Let's evaluate that. And last but not least, a general passage that I think can easily be applied to marriages here, though it is out of the context as it's applied generally to the church. Colossians, put on then as God's chosen ones, right? We are His beloved, holy and beloved. What are we supposed to do? Compassion. We're supposed to have compassionate hearts. Be compassionate to one another. We're to respond in kindness to one another. We're to have humility. assuming that we can be wrong and that we mess up and that we get things incorrect. We're to have meekness, this idea of not weakness, but power that's restrained and brought into subjection underneath your own self-control, power that is restrained. And patience, endurance, patience, this idea. And then, verse 13, bearing with one another. You can apply that to your spouse here. Bearing with one another when people mess up, when there's faults or disagreements. And if one has a complaint against one another, which is where most of these arguments in a relationship stem from, you said this, you did this, you didn't do this, you didn't say this, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must forgive. And above all these, put on love, the same quality of love that Jesus models for us. The goal here in relationships is to not be quarreling, to not be fighting. So as you think and you evaluate and you say, where are we? Where are we as a couple? To think about conflict is a helpful tool to say, are we modeling Colossians 3 and how we should be living with everybody in the church? And is our relationship a little microcosm of how we're failing to obey these commands of Paul and of the Lord? To say we are no longer living this way with other people because the people that we're closest with, the people that we care about the most, we're not doing it with them. Well, of course, then how are we going to do it in the church? Right? God is giving you a testing ground to see if you are going to be obedient to these things by moving past your disagreements, getting over it quickly, maintaining that intimacy, and functioning within your roles. Okay, so evaluate your commitment to biblical roles, evaluate your level of intimacy, evaluate your management of conflict, and last but not least, because there's so many more, evaluate your commitment to spiritual growth. Okay, I gotta take you to some weird places here because I really want to try to just make a point here for my last point. Above all else, this point should be first. You have to have a resolve, a commitment, a steeled focus, a zeal to pursue spiritual growth in your own life, and you should also have it to see your wife or your husband pursue it in his life. You should want to do everything in your power to see this be the priority of your marriage. More so than the function of your biblical roles. You shouldn't deny that. You shouldn't not care about it. More than your level of intimacy, both physical and relational. More than how you deal with conflict. There should be a priority in your life that the goal of both of your lives is to pursue Christ, to see him honored in your lives, and to push the other person to do the same. That should be the goal, okay? Now, I want to take you to a passage here just to make a quick point, and then we'll wrap up and you guys can go to your groups. Now, I'm going to read this and just follow with me. I'll try to explain it, but it's just a great argument that Paul is making that I think we all struggle with to some degree. We need to understand what he's saying. So 1 Corinthians 7. Now concerning the matters which I wrote to you, we already read this, right? It's good for a man to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation, all that, okay? Then we go down to verse 5. Do not deprive one another, and then he adds this line. Here's an exception. He's saying, okay, in terms of physical intimacy with one another and the temptations that Satan's going to use to draw you apart to sin against God and against one another, don't deprive one another physically. Wait, there's an exception. What's the exception? Except, perhaps, by agreement, that you have mutual agreement for a limited time, there's a limit to this, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again. Well, why does Paul say this? Why is he explaining it this way? He's saying, okay, you're married, you have a physical relationship, you have sex with one another, there's something beneficial to that. Don't neglect it, don't deny it, don't seek other people, all these qualifications that he gives. But he says, but there is a circumstance that supersedes this. You can say no upon mutual agreement if you're pursuing the thing that is more important than your relationship, than your intimacy, than your knowledge of one another, than your functions. And that is pursuing the things of Christ, giving yourself to prayer and devotion to the Lord. These things take priority. And you're saying, okay, is that really what he's saying? Well, we're going to keep going. As he continues on in 1 Corinthians, he says this. Now concerning the betrothed, and we have this whole argument about those people that are engaged in this context. It says, I have no command from the Lord. He's giving his opinion here. But I give my judgment as one whom by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress He's saying, in the view of what's going on currently in the world of where he's at his time, it is good for a person to remain as he is. He's essentially saying, don't get married, right? He clarifies. He says, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Okay, saying general principle, maybe better if you don't get married, but if you're, wherever you are, just kind of stay in that position. Don't seek to get out of anything. Just stay where you're at. So if you're bound to a wife, and the word here in the Greek is virgin, so he's talking about the betrothed to a virgin, don't seek to get out of that betrothal. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So just kind of be okay with where you are. But then he says in verse 28, if you do marry, you have not sinned. Okay, so we're clear there. It's not a bad thing to marry. If your betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, he says, difficulty. And I would spare you of that. He's wanting to say, hey, there's going to be difficulty if you get married. There's going to be a challenge between you and your spouse. You're going to be divided. And he says, this is what I mean. He's clarifying, so we all have clarity. Verse 29, this is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. Things are looking dark. Christ is on the doorstep, is how he's viewing it here. He says, from now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. What is he saying? He goes on to say a bunch of other things that are similar. Live those that are mourning as though they were not mourning. What is Paul trying to say here from his own opinion? What he's stating, he's saying, not necessarily reject your responsibility, forsake your responsibility, don't function your roles, don't do all these things, but you have to have, given the times and given the reality of Christ's return and the seemingly imminent nature of that Paul even understands in his own time, to pursue the things of the Lord with such a steadfast resolve that has got to be the priority, regardless of your marital status. That the two of you together, regardless of if you're betrothed or married or you're together or whatever, you need to live as though your single devotion is to the Lord, but you can't fully do that because you have other responsibilities. But he's saying, to the best of your ability, do that. Live in that way. Even though you can't fully. You can't just deny your worldly responsibilities, your responsibilities to your spouse and your family because you're married and you have kids. You can't. But let those who are in this circumstance pursue the Lord with this steadfastness, this zeal. He goes on to say that the married person's interests are divided in this, and he's saying that the goal at the end of this whole argument is not to lay any restraint, not to say you shouldn't get married or you should. He's not trying to make a command that's from God. He's clarifying that's not the case, but he does say the whole point of this argument is to promote good order of how things should work and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. That's the whole point of this argument. And so I would say when you're thinking about where your marriage is at, the thing that should rise to the top of the list. We're skipping these. Sorry. Here you go. Take a screenshot. There you go. Additional things. What I'm saying is what should rise to the top of your list is your commitment to pursuing the Lord and your spouse's commitment to pursuing the Lord. If you want to see your relationship go in the right direction, be concerned about the roles, be concerned about the intimacy, take note of how you manage conflict. Those are all going to be good markers of evaluation. But first and foremost, let these things rise to the top. The reality of you having a devotion to the Lord and pursuing that and pushing one another to that end. The relationship that is pursuing Christ hard doesn't have time to not function in the roles, doesn't have the ability to get into lots of conflicts. They're going hard at Christ, and Christ is keeping them together. This is something that every single one of us should care about deeply. So, here's our 4 things that I want you to think through tonight in your groups in the time that you have remaining, to discuss openly and say, where are we here? Am I functioning in my roles? Are we divided? Are we not relationally connected? Are we getting into fights? Are we going in the wrong direction or the right direction? And are we committed one for another and on our own to spiritual growth? And I think this is the goal of this here is to just kind of reset. Just to kind of say, where are we right now? Where are we in our marriage? If we're good, good. Let's do a little bit better. If we're bad, that's okay. Let's make some steps to improve. Get that mutual encouragement that you need, that bolstering from other believers in this group to pursue having a godly marriage based off of these principles. All right, let me pray for you, and then you guys are off to your groups. God, help us all, as Paul so clearly says that being married is to add some difficulty to life, and as much joy as it brings, we can all testify to that reality that it does complicate things. It does make life difficult at times, and yet in the midst of that, God, you have clearly provided spouses. You have clearly put us in this position, and even this principle that overlays it, that we should not seek to get out of it. God, we do not want to seek to get out of it. We are firm in our commitment to our spouses, and yet, God, we want to be biblical. We want to have good relationships. We want to be close, but most of all, we want to pursue you. So God, help us now, even as we evaluate and take some time to reset and think about our marriages, this necessary thing to spend time evaluating where we're at to make improvements that we do in other areas of life. God, help us to do that well tonight, to do it openly, and to do it with an aim of seeing you glorified in our marriages. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.